Okay, I think this is working. This is my first time trying this out, so bear with me if we have some technical difficulties along the way. Um, Greetings. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vicar Courtney at First Lutheran Church in Waltham. I am really glad and excited that you have joined us for this Women in the Bible study. For our first woman that we are going to study this morning, we are looking at Hagar. We will also talk a little bit about Sarah along the way, but for the most part, we're going to focus on Hagar. Part of doing this study is to read some women that you may not know much about, and maybe to read women that you do know about in more of a liberating way. So this really comes out of a book that I've been reading called Consider the Women by Debbie Bloom. And that's really where I got most of my knowledge about Hagar, to be honest. And so with that in mind, I want to start with a question, and I want you to think about, what do you know about the story of Hagar, and what do you know about her? For me, before reading this book and before working on this study, I really didn't know a whole lot. I mean, I knew about Sarah, and I knew about Sarah and Hagar not really getting along, but I didn't really know the story. And actually what I did know the most about, came from a painting that I saw in a church that I worked at. And it kind of depicted Hagar as, put it this way, she looked really jealous. She looked maybe a little bit angry, and she didn't look like someone that I would want to be friends with. And so when I started reading this book, Consider the Women, and started hearing about how wonderful Hagar's story is, I really got excited, and I wanted to discover more about Hagar and about her story, and ways that we can read her in a positive and uplifting light. So in order to start, if you have already read the text, then this will be a little bit of an overview. And if you have not, we will go through kind of the story. So we first see Hagar in Genesis chapter 16. She is the slave of Sarah or Sarai. They are the same people. Abraham and Sarah are also Abram and Sarai, so their names change when God renames them, but they are the same people. If that's a little confusing, it's always confusing for me too. In the story, Sarah is barren. At this point, we're very certain of that. Sarah has not given birth. She's in her 80s. And I don't think, today that would be very not normal. But back then, Sarah was barren. And what she did was she gave her slave Hagar to Abraham in order to produce an heir. Now, for us, this feels really icky and disgusting. But it was really quite legal at the time. And some marriage contracts during Abraham and Sarah's time stated that if a wife could not produce an heir, she could legally give her slave to be used as a surrogate or a concubine, because that lineage was just so important at that time. In doing this and in giving Hagar to Abraham, she was not quite a wife. She was more a concubine. But what it did was it elevated her status in the house. She was higher than a slave, but less than a wife. And we'll see how that plays out. Hagar gets pregnant. This shows that it was not Abraham. It was Sarah, for the reasons that they were barren. And in discovering that she's pregnant, Hagar looks on Sarah with contempt. Now, we have no idea what really could have been happening, and how Hagar may have handled the situation. But what this does is it escalates Sarah and her emotions and her anger and her frustration at the situation, and leads Sarah to abuse Hagar. Pretty roughly is what I would imagine, because Hagar flees into the wilderness. This is a really big deal. because it makes Hagar the first person to liberate herself from abuse in the Bible. It also, to me, indicates that Sarah was potentially ruthless, even though Hagar was pregnant and even though she was producing an heir. To me, this reading is not favorable for Sarah. So while in the wilderness, Hagar meets God. God gives her a promise to make her descendants as numerous as the stars. And in return, Hagar names God. She uses the name El Roi or El Roi, depending on how you say it. And it means God who sees, because God saw her and heard her. And she lived to tell the tale, something that was very shocking to her. She was not. In the text, it sounds that she was fearful because she wasn't sure if she would live long enough to tell people that she talked to God. Something important in this section is that God makes promises to Hagar, nearly the same promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah in relation to their descendants. This promise to Hagar is so important because it shows that God goes outside of the bounds of God's chosen people. God saw Hagar and said, I will make your descendants great. What increases the power of this is that the Muslim tradition traces their roots through Ishmael. So we know that God literally creates a nation and a whole peoples out of Hagar. This section is also really important to talk about because it is often called a text of terror. In this, God sees Hagar and says, "Why are you running?" And Hagar says, "I'm running from abuse." And God says, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." This text has been used to justify women returning to abusive situations, and that is not okay. It is very hard to read this text, but it's important to focus on the fact that in all of this kind of elements of terror, God is with Hagar. God promises to protect her, and God continues to promise that her descendants will be numerous. So know that this is also a text of terror that I wrestle with. I don't have all of the answers for how we can read it positively. But these texts of terror in the Bible, we need to talk about them so that they're not used for harm. Instead, with this text, I want to focus on the promise that God is with her and the promises that God makes with her. And the chapter ends with Ishmael's birth, healthy baby boy. Fast forward a couple of chapters and we revisit Hagar in Genesis 21. Sarah is pregnant and gives birth to Isaac, notably the true heir. Whether or not you believe that is up for debate. The problem is that Sarah is just so focused on this idea of inheritance. And now that she is a child of her own, the full blood of Sarah and Abraham, she is worried about what that means for Ishmael. If Ishmael is around, will he get more inheritance than Isaac? For Sarah, she wants there to be no question. Isaac is the true heir, and therefore Ishmael needs to go. What this causes is Sarah to convince Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Now, if you read the text closely, I get the feeling that Abraham doesn't want to do this. He does not want to send away his oldest son, and I can't blame him. But God talks to Abraham. He says, "This is your offspring. I will take care of him. And so listen to Sarah and send them away. I will be with them and all will be well." So Hagar and Ishmael venture into the wilderness, and after running out of water and food, And on the verge of death, Hagar puts down her child and runs back and forth between the mountains looking for water or a caravan or a settlement or anything that could save their lives. She cries out to God and says, "Don't make me watch my child die." This is a powerful plea and prayer to God. And God sees and hears Hagar and provides for her. This idea, this running back and forth between the mountains, is actually part of the Muslim rituals in the pilgrimage to Mecca, which shows how important Hagar and Ishmael are to Muslim people. So in hearing and providing for Hagar, God cares for them for the duration of their life. The Hebrew scriptures end here, but the Muslim tradition and the Islamic stories continue to tell the story that Abraham knew where Ishmael was and that he went to visit, emphasizing that Abraham loved Hagar and loved his son Ishmael. And even though this is where the stories divide, Hagar and Ishmael on one side and Sarah and Isaac on the other, the Muslim tradition grew out of Hagar and Ishmael, and that is really powerful. And the thought that Abraham goes back and forth between both is really, really wonderful. So I share that because I think that's a really important piece that our scriptures leave out. So a little bit of background information on Hagar. She is an Egyptian slave. She is a racial outsider, a slave, and she endures a wilderness experience. And this makes her a prominent figure in the Black community and in the Black church. And I want to read just a quick little quote out of Rachel Held Evans' book, Inspired. She quotes Alan Dwight Callahan in saying, "African slaves and their descendants discerned something in the Bible that was neither at the center of their ancestral cultures nor in evidence of their hostile American home, a warrant for justice in this world. They found woven in the texts of the Bible a crimson thread of divine justice, antithetical to the injustice they had come to know all too well. Hagar's story is that of empowerment and wonder. And I lift that up as an important part of our Bible and of our reading of Scripture. Hagar is also the first person to cry in the Bible. This makes her an icon of strength in the midst of despair, a sign of how far she was willing to go to save her son, that she was willing to be vulnerable and to allow her faith to be mixed up in emotions, which is something that we might all be experiencing and in need of reminder as well. She is the mother of Ishmael, and per Muslim tradition, Muhammad is also a descendant of Ishmael. And so that's just a really cool that I discovered and learned a lot about in that first book, Consider the Women. And Hagar is also a woman who fled abuse. She's the first female to liberate herself in the Bible. And even though she does in fact return home, she returns home knowing that God is with her and that God will protect her. She is the only person to name God in the Hebrew scriptures, which is really important. And she is one of 3 women who talk to God. The other 2, I believe, are the prophets Huldah and Deborah. So these are just some interesting kind of background facts, all of which I find really interesting. So looking at a little bit of traditional interpretation for the story of Hagar, this influences, it predates all of us, but continues to have important influences on how we read scripture. So Paul in Galatians, good old Paul, he talks about Hagar as an object of scorn. He says she is worthless, and Sarah was right to cast her away. And this influenced much of the patriarchal interpretation of the story. So there's a little biblical interpretation. Thank you, Paul, for your words. Then we have Luther. And in a good old Luther both and fashion, Luther has both a negative and a positive view on Hagar. He accuses her of kidnapping Ishmael, and he blames her for the sins of the family. However, he does say that she is an example of patience in the face of suffering when she flees from her abuser and is discovering and trying to live in the wilderness. And lastly, we have Calvin, who regards Hagar as having a wild temper, making her less than an ideal female companion. Now, any woman who has a wild temper, bless you. Because we are powerful and strong women, and that does not make us the less than ideal. So live into those emotions and don't let these old men dictate that for you. That was my little rant for the day. So all of that being said, these very powerful interpretations, how might they have influenced the way that you traditionally read Hagar's story? Or maybe the way that you read it before today? One thing is that there's often a lot of emphasis on Sarah and not as much on Hagar. It's Sarah's story, not Hagar's. Another thing in that is that Hagar and Sarah are often put against each other. We have to pick one over the other. And traditionally that has been Sarah, making Sarah good and holy and Hagar anything but. They're polarized characters. And what I'm calling us to today is how can we read both of them, not against each other, but informing each other? And how can we find redemption and love and a place for both of them? So a few lessons from Hagar, and there are many, many more. I invite you to share them with me and let me know what you think yours are, but these are 3 that I wanted to impart. If we are lost, abused, or abandoned, God will hear us when we call, regardless of if we are in or out. God spends considerable amount of time seeing, hearing, and helping Hagar when everyone else seems to have written her off. And God spends considerable amount of time with you, hearing you, seeing you, and helping you. Whether you have been cast out or abandoned or feeling lost or scared, God sees you and is with you no matter what. An interesting element is that sometimes we need to travel the wilderness to reach home. It is in the wilderness that Hagar meets God and names God. It is in the wilderness where Hagar almost dies and is saved by God. This time right now of COVID-19 also kind of feels like a wilderness moment, as many of us are experiencing the difficulties and the trials. And I wonder what it will mean to reach home and how we can be there for each other as we discover what home really is. And lastly, this is my favorite lesson from Hagar. Hagar is a woman caught in the middle of unequal power based upon the patriarchy and race. Yet she went on to create a whole nation. This woman is powerful. She is incredible. And in the middle of patriarchy and race that are continuing to influence and terrorize today in 2020, this woman creates a whole nation. This woman is seen by God, is lifted up, is cared for, and is awesome. And so I hope that she can be a model for us in how we can stand up against unequal power and find ways to tear it down. I want to end, here's the image from the first page by Wright Pittman. And she has this beautiful description. I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I don't love putting that many words out, but it was really wonderful. I wanted to share it. But her description of the painting, she says, "For me, Hagar is an icon of strength and sustenance in those dry desert places." And I think that is such a beautiful tribute to Hagar. She is an icon of strength and sustenance throughout this whole story. And I hope that she can be that in your life as well. This is the end of my video for today. A few notes. If you don't have the worksheet, feel free to download that from the website or from the This Week email that went out. That has just a little bit extra to go if you want to spend time in Bible study in your own home. It also has a list of resources that I have been using. So if you are a book hoarder like me, it's got all kinds of resources that I have been using, just to hold up a few of them. They're all listed on there if you want to utilize them for yourself. Also, in that continued kind of research and study for yourself, there are artistic representations of Hagar. If you are interested in looking at the different ways that Hagar was represented over the years through art, and maybe how that can contribute to how we interpret her story. Lastly, if you are available, feel free to join us on Tuesday, May 12th at 3:30 p.m. on Zoom, and we will talk. I have no agenda. Bring your questions, your comments, concerns, anything that you want to share. I also welcome emails or phone calls if you want to talk further. I'm really excited about this study, and I hope that you are finding something new within it as well. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to hearing from you or seeing you, and I will get working on our next video soon. Thank you again, and I hope that you have a great week. Stay well.